Reforms by any route, as we discussed, is, after all, reforms. I'm sure you agree that the farm loss and dismantling of MSP would have eventually improved the productivity of our agriculture sector, which is very, very essential. In spite of that, critical state elections may have played a role in the rollback, which we saw. So would you consider this a positive step as it signals that there is respect for the voter?
Look, I think that in the farm laws, there were some good elements, and I've said that repeatedly, but also it was a centralized one-size-fits-all kind of law. And obviously, it impacted different states in different ways. Experts in the agricultural area tell me that it could have been much better tailored, especially if large elements of it had been decentralized to the states to figure out what worked best for them. That said, the MSPs are also something that a lot of farmers have grown to, rely upon. And so you can't threaten to take it away without some adequate substitute. And what was important was a dialogue and shaping what that substitute would look like. When you talk to farmers, they're obviously very concerned about, for example, growing rice in Punjab, which is a water scarce state. But how do you move from that? That's where the dialogue comes in. And so my sense is that this should not be a signal to abandon reform, but to start talking about how you would implement it in a way that first takes into account the interests of different parties, but then is much more clever about how to, in a sense, formulate it such that it has broader appeal. I'm not saying it's always easy. In fact, it's very difficult, but that's the challenge of governance in a vibrant, raucous democracy like ours.
You've been critical of India's China-like manufacturing push. Not critical, I wouldn't say that you were totally against it. Can you explain what are your arguments about the flaws in pursuing manufacturing mainly, and why do you think it won't work for us? You also spoke about an alternative path, one that focuses on global services market. Can you elaborate on this? How does our democratic system become an advantage in this endeavor? And what should we do?
Right. First, I'm not saying in any way we should abandon manufacturing. There are, lots of places where we're doing reasonably well. In fact, very well when you look at, for example, the two-wheeler industry. We're the biggest two-wheeler industry in the world. But what I'm saying is, let's not put all our eggs in the manufacturing basket. And I would say there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. One, the manufacturing space is obviously hyper-competitive, like many other things in the world, but it's also where authoritarian governments have a lot more capacity to ram through the decisions that are needed. For instance, one of the ways China grew very fast was by suppressing wages, but also by suppressing the interest that savers got on deposits, so as to create strong negative real interest rates, which then fueled industry with cheap capital. So cheap capital, cheap labor, that was how they grew. And of course, on infrastructure, it's very easy to do infrastructure when you can just take the land and no questions asked, without a protest, without any kinds of problems. And so they've been able to build out fantastic infrastructure. What they build out we have all heard the stories of their high-speed rail network, et cetera, while we're struggling to build that project between Mumbai and Ahmedabad. And it is taking us many more years than we calculated initially. So infrastructure, countries like Vietnam, countries like China that don't have as vibrant a democracy have a better sort of chance of building it out. Similarly, I think, they've got there first. And because they got there first, they've also seen the pushback from the industrial world to an expansion in manufacturing. So the problem for us in imitating China's path is China's already created the backlash in the West to manufacturing-led growth. It's not that we will be able to manufacture those cheap assembly line stuff that China manufactured and sent to the US without seeing a similar kind of backlash to India. There's a lot of sensitivity to this kind of stuff today. So what I'm saying is, let's think about what worked for us. What worked for us was first higher skilled manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, but also some of these auto ancillaries and so on. But also what worked for us was services. We've had a tremendous run with software services. So given that the pandemic has now opened up the possibility for cross-border services in a much bigger way, my niece in Bangalore, spent the entire pandemic not traveling, but working as a consultant across India. Question is, if she could work as a consultant across India, why can't she work as a consultant for Chicago, for New York, etc.? That is the kind of thing we need to explore. Similarly, telemedicine, up 20% in the US during the pandemic. Why can't telemedicine be offered from India? Now, there are barriers. There are barriers. For instance, there's the issue of degrees. Is the Indian medical degree recognized outside? Well, if we need equivalence, what do we need to do? Right now, for example, the national health system in the UK is overloaded. Can we have a dialogue with the UK authorities and say, we'll take some of the overload off with Indian doctors from India? We'll do telemedicine. But for that, what is the kind of certificate they need? Can we start having exams which are available to Indian doctors? Now, of course, even as we start having these negotiations, we also need to negotiate with NHS. Will you pay from the NHS for Indian services, or will you say only UK doctors can get paid? That's the kind of negotiation we have to have if the UK wants to trade with India. Let's talk about selling services to the UK and whether they will, in fact, bring down some of the barriers that exist today. But of course, from the Indian perspective, we also have to up our game. We have seen all these doctors coming back from Ukraine, or students studying to be doctors. Clearly, there's a lot of demand in India for learning to become doctors. We have an undersupply of medical training institutions, but that's an opportunity. We can build much more, and we can elevate somebody who earlier had the prospect of working in a manufacturing line to a much higher value added service, providing service to the world. And given that the developed world is going much more into services, that's where the demand is. Well, let's leapfrog manufacturing if we can. I'm not saying penalize manufacturing. I'm saying don't put all your eggs in the manufacturing basket and say we still have to follow the Chinese path. That Chinese path is much harder because China's already there and has already created the backlash. And instead, there's a path which is open, the services path, which we followed with software services. Who would have thought we'd have become a giant there? Can we do far more than just software? We already have a reputation. In the US, you talk doctors, everybody thinks Indian. Mr. Patel, Dr. Patel, Dr. Shah. Why can't we exploit that reputation for good service and sell to the world? And I'll come to the democratic part in a second.
I think you also spoke about data privacy and rule of law in that context, and that we have an advantage there. Can you please expand on that?
Absolutely. So, when China sells this gadget, so long as it is not an information sensitive gadget, supposing it's a toaster, I really don't care, where it was made once I get it, so long as it works, right? The problem with many services is I really care where it is being produced. If I'm dealing with a doctor, I care that they are protecting my patient records. They don't, go broadcasting it around. They don't sell it to companies who can then exploit my data to, sell me products that I'm, particularly vulnerable to buy. So there are these issues with services which involve data privacy, data access, and where as a authoritarian country, I would be very, very worried if my data were held by that country, and so would my country authorities. What kind of people are buying this service from a China or a Russia? What kind of blackmail could they be subject to? And so, if we are an open, vibrant democracy, we look as if we can be trusted. But if in addition, we bring in sort of protections which are consistent with our democracy, consistent with the Supreme Court ruling, I think it was 2017, which protect the privacy of the individual, protects their data, not just from dissemination by the company that gets it, but even by intervention by the government. If we can show that we have the checks and balances that can be trusted, then we become trusted service providers to the world, because we are saying, look, even our government can't get at that data without a court order, and our judicial system is respectable and will not give that court order for frivolous needs. So my sense is we have a chance to build on our democratic values. We have a chance to essentially leapfrog where leapfrog into this new area of services. But our democracy should be seen as an advantage there rather than as a disadvantage, and we should build on it.
So one more point on the perception from the outside, we being a democracy, rule of law, etc. We spoke just now. You also touched upon in a very minor manner, but it's something that is very